Hey guys, welcome back to Ace Recaps. Today, I'm going to explain a 2024 fantasy horror film titled The Watchers. Heads up, spoilers ahead, you've been warned. There is a forest in the west of Ireland that does not appear on any map. It draws in people who are suffering from mental illnesses, and no one in the outside world knows exactly what lies inside. And the people that enter the forest never come back out. Sounds like a great tourist attraction. We watch John running for his life through the forest. He crosses a signboard and looks at the time, trying to get out of the forest before the sun sets. He soon stops and spots the signboard once again, realizing that he's just been running in circles. As nightfall comes, all the birds in the forest fly away. John, realizing he has no more time left, decides to climb up a tree for safety, but unfortunately, one of the branches breaks and he falls to the ground, injuring his legs. Pro tip: when running from monsters, maybe don't climb trees. He crawls to his bag, gets out a knife, and hides by some trees. But in vain, an unknown creature drags him into a pit, never to be seen again. A few weeks later, we are introduced to Mina, an employee at the local pet store. Her boss informs her that she needs to deliver a parrot to a zoo a few hundred miles away, and she agrees to drop it off the next day. That night, she puts on a wig and goes to a nearby club where she lies about her identity and hooks up with a man. Early the next morning, she sets off on her journey along with the parrot. She answers a call from her twin sister, which is when we realize that she lost her mom when she was just a little girl, and to this day still blames herself for the accident. On her way, she stops at a gas station where we notice a bunch of flyers of people that went missing in the area. Nothing says welcome to the neighborhood quite like a wall of missing people. She continues on her drive, and soon gets in the middle of a forest where her radio malfunctions and soon her engine shuts down. She tries restarting it, but it doesn't work, so she gets out of her car and tries to call for help, but her phone has no signal. Car trouble in a creepy forest? Never seen that in a horror movie before. She looks around and comes across a similar signboard that we saw at the beginning of the movie. Thinking that there must be a house nearby, she decides to walk on foot along with the bird. After walking for a while in the forest, she decides to get back to her car and wait for someone to pass by. Much to her horror, she soon realizes that she's lost in the middle of nowhere. On the bright side, at least there's no traffic. She sits on the ground, understanding that she just might not make it alive, and names the parrot Darwin. Let's hope this Darwin's theory of survival doesn't involve becoming monster food. Just then, as the sun sets, a large flock of birds flies over her. As she looks around, she spots a woman in the shadows and runs after her. They soon get to a cabin, where the old woman tells her to run if she values her life. Now, that's what I call a warm Irish welcome. Mina runs as fast as she can and gets in just before the woman seals the door shut. Inside the cabin, she is introduced to Madeline, Ciara, and Daniel. All of them claim to have wandered into the forest and have been lost in there ever since. Madeline tells her that they haven't got much time and instructs everyone to stand by a large two-way mirror so that the watchers outside the cabin can look at them. Ciara tells her that the watchers come every night just after the sun sets and observes them until the sun rises again. Daniel, an odd fellow, starts giggling as he hears the creatures arrive. Mina is asked to step forward to introduce herself as the new member of the group, which is when she hears loud rumbling and claps as the watchers welcome her into the forest. A little while later, Mina sits by herself the entire night, and early next morning decides to head on her way by herself, as she believes that these people have lost their minds. She walks by herself for a while and soon spots a little girl in the woods. As the child turns around, she realizes that it's herself as a kid. She panics and starts to run away, until she gets to a steep ledge, which is when she actually realizes that there's no way for her to find her way out by herself. A little while later, Madeline approaches her and tells her that they've all tried getting out and failed. She then guides her through the woods and explains that the forest is known to cause hallucinations, and that if they're not careful, they can be driven mad. Madeline shows her the signboard, and tells her that they are positioned in a perfect circle around the forest, each within a half-day's journey from the cabin. If they stay within the boundary, they can return back to the cabin by nightfall, and if they choose to step over the line, there's no turning back. She speculates that a random man whom they call the professor set up these signboards as a warning. That night at the cabin, Daniel puts on a show for the watchers, dictating their events of the day. Madeline tells Mina to just go on about her life, as that's all the creatures really want, and Ciara performs a dance for them. An old TV in the room has just one show that they keep watching over and over again. Well, that's still more variety than daytime television. The next morning, everyone parts ways to find food for them to eat. Mina and Ciara stick together where she explains to her all the different plants and their medicinal properties. She tells Mina about her husband John, who left the cabin 6 days ago to find a way out, but hasn't yet returned. When Mina inquires about the watchers, Ciara takes her to one of the burrows where the creatures go during the daylight. Back at the cabin, Madeline explains the 3 rules to Mina. Do not turn your back to the mirror, do not open the door after dark, and do not go near the burrows. The watchers only allow them to live as long as they follow their rules. That night, Mina hopelessly walks around the cabin and taps on the glass. Suddenly, the Watchers start growling and screeching loudly, so Madeline holds her still so that the creatures can have a good look at her. Note to self, monsters don't appreciate the tap-tap at the zoo routine. A few days later, Daniel and Mina go around the forest and check on all the traps they've set up, hoping to catch something for dinner. We realize that Ciara and her husband arrived there around 5 months ago, whereas Daniel's been there for 8 months, and nobody really knows how long Madeline's been there. Forget TripAdvisor, this forest getaway has killer retention rates. This makes Mina trust Madeline's rules even less. As she looks for answers, Mina rushes over to one of the burrows while Daniel warns her against it, but Mina is persistent in finding out the truth. She ties a rope around her waist and Daniel lowers her into the burrow. With a lighter, she finds an old newspaper, a camcorder, and a bicycle. As she passes it all up to Daniel, she hears the creatures rumbling all around her, but they aren't able to get to her as she stands in the sunlight. Just then she sees a hand coming towards her that soon crumbles into dust as it gets into the light. She screams out to Daniel and luckily gets out in time. Back at the cabin, she shows the group their findings and lies to them that it was found by the trees. Daniel manages to fix the camcorder to the TV, so they now have a way to actually look at the creatures outside, and they plan to use the bicycle to go past the signboard. Great, now they can out-pedal the monsters. That night, as they patiently wait, the Watchers don't arrive as they usually do. Suddenly, they hear a knock on the door and a man claiming it's John and that he's returned at last. Through the TV, they see the legs of a human standing by, pleading for them to open the door. Ciara goes to finally reunite with her husband, but Madeline stops her, claiming it's all a trick. So Ciara asks him some personal questions, but he isn't able to answer a single one. They ask him to hold the camera by his face, and as he does so, we see that it's actually John, the man who was dragged away at the beginning of the movie. Suddenly, he is pulled away by the Watchers, and the creatures start roaring loudly and even crack the mirror. The next morning, Mina comes clean about everything and they return all the items back into the burrow. Monsters these days, so picky about their lost and found. A month goes by, and Mina is acquainted with the routes of the forest, so she goes out by herself and marks the trees. She sits by the woods and recalls what really went down when she was a child. As her mother was driving her and her sister back home, Mina was a very stubborn and annoying child. As her mother was trying to correct her, she ended up losing control of the car and crashing into an oncoming truck, losing her life in the process. To this day, she still blames herself for the incident. She snaps out of it when she hears Madeline and Daniel arguing over why they aren't catching any food for them to survive. Mina decides to ignore this and goes back to the cabin and continues mapping the forest as Ciara sits by the TV depressed. Just then, Ciara vanishes, and Mina runs into the forest looking for her and finds her by one of the burrows, prepared to jump in and end it once and for all. Just then they hear Madeline scream and rush in to investigate. They see that Daniel has tied her to a tree and he rushes back to the cabin to get in before the sun sets, and Ciara runs after him. Well, that's one way to call dibs on the cabin. Mina stays back and unties her, but it's already late by the time they get back to the cabin and Daniel refuses to let them in, claiming that he'd be breaking the rules if he does so. Someone's taking the no-take-backsies rule a bit too seriously. Having no time to lose, Mina and Madeline run back into the forest and hide under a tree, hoping to survive the night by going undetected by the Watchers. Because if it works for ostriches, it must work for humans too, right? Soon the creatures come out of the woods one by one and gather in front of the cabin as Mina and Madeline watch in fear. Daniel and Ciara stand by the mirror and await the arrival of the creatures, but noticing that 2 of them are missing, they start to growl loudly and scatter around the forest to look for them. Mina and Madeline use this opportunity to run back to the cabin, and Mina guilt trips him into finally opening the door and letting them in. All 4 of them stand by the mirror, and Madeline explains to them how she was a mythology teacher in the real world, and knowing what was inside the forest, came into it on purpose. After spending a few days there, she saw one for the first time, but to her shock, she saw herself. The creature had replicated her after seeing her through the glass. She explains that the Watchers are a very ancient species and go by names such as shapeshifters and fairies. The reason they are watching them is so that they can learn and become humans themselves. This is why they will never let them leave the forest. Monsters wanting to be human? They clearly haven't been watching the news. Suddenly, the creatures start crawling all over the cabin and speak in a human voice. When they move the table to block the door, they notice a secret vault underneath it. They open it and rush in just as the creatures break through the main door. When they get to the bunker below the cabin, they see enough food to last them years without having to hunt. Mina finds an old computer, and as they go through it, they finally see the professor, the man who built the cabin. He introduces himself as Rory Kilmartin. He recorded these videos every day since he built the cabin, and he considers it his greatest achievement. Move over, YouTubers. This guy's trapped in a monster forest channel is about to go viral. He built the cabin in the center of their habitat and calls it his wonderland. Since machines wouldn't work there, he had to get in a generator and had to rely on manual labor to get the work done. He called in 13 men a day from neighboring villages, men with no money and family, and at the end of each day, he would ask them to eat supper outside, as he quietly slipped into the bunker, inevitably sacrificing them to the Watchers, all in the pursuit of knowledge. And here I thought my old boss was bad. He soon saw the creatures stalk him every night through the glass and start to replicate him, trying to become him. One day, he manages to capture one of them and tries to befriend and train it. As Mina goes through all the videos, she gets to the 300th day where he tells them that he's fallen in love with the creature, but all it wants to do is kill him, because Tinder just wasn't cutting it for him anymore. By this time he's gotten depressed and has decided to kill the creature he raised in himself. He tells them about a boat he left by the river, past signboard 134 where the birds leave the woods. He ends the video by begging whoever is watching to go to his office at the university and burn everything he has on these creatures so nobody wanders into the forest. Listening to this, the four of them now know how to finally get out of the forest, so Daniel and Ciara spend the night dancing together, and she even promises him a place to stay in her home. The next morning, as they climb out of the bunker, they see that the cabin's been completely trashed by the Watchers. They make their way through the woods and get to signboard 134, and cross it for the first time in ages. They let go of the parrot from its cage and decide to follow its lead. Fly, Darwin, fly. Show those monsters what survival of the fittest really means. On their way, they come across a large cement structure of the Watchers, and Madeline claims that once upon a time, these creatures lived amongst humans as gods. But over time, the power of the Watchers started to frighten humans, and they were ultimately banished in a tomb deep underground. It was sealed in by a great door, but for centuries these creatures clawed their way to the surface, and were finally free, only to discover that they had lost their wings and magic, and that they could never leave the forest. So basically, they turned into millennials. As they continue on their journey, they all start hallucinating different aspects of their life. As nightfall comes, the birds from the forest fly away and the Watchers awaken and start tracking down the four. They finally get to the river and rush into the boat. Daniel hears someone scream and sees John injured in the forest, so he decides to help him out. By the time the others realize that Daniel is not with them, they see the creature break his leg and finally kill him. As they sorrowfully row away, we see all the Watchers gather by the river, replicating Daniel as he's now part of the forest forever. The next morning, they wake up by a bridge and get on a bus to the city. Mina agrees to go to the university and burn all of the professor's work on the forest, and they all part ways. Mina goes home and finally freshens up and heads to the university the next day where she lies about being the professor's sister. As she goes through his research, we realize that in ancient times the fairies lived amongst humans as guardians, friends, and even mates. The half-blooded children born through this were extremely skilled at cloning humans, unlike the fairies that had an obvious tell. As she goes through his office, she is shocked to find a picture of Madeline on his desk. She rushes to Ciara's house and tells her that Madeline is, in fact, a half-blooded fairy. When the professor lost his wife to cancer, he made it his life's mission to bring her back, which is why he went into the forest to capture one of the Watchers in order to clone his wife. At that moment, the real Ciara comes back home, which is when Mina realizes that the woman standing in front of her is Madeline. She claims that only she could leave the forest because she was part human and was looking for a way for ages. Madeline takes Daniel's form and blames the humans for trapping her kind in the forest, and is now seeking out revenge by becoming one of them. Shapeshifting, the best way to gaslight someone. She attacks Ciara and transforms into Mina, and just as she's about to kill her, Mina tries her best to bring out her human side, expressing their emotions as a family in the forest. Luckily this works, and Madeline transforms into a hideous-looking fairy and flies away. The movie ends with Mina finally reuniting with her sister and sharing her story of the forest, while a strange-looking girl stalks her from outside her home. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.